Okay, I think we are live. Great. Do you want this in here? Do you want me to get it out of the way altogether?
Leave it because I might be sitting while people are reading.
Okay. Hi, everyone. This is the first post-Vega 24 class. Or I guess you could call it the first Vega 26 class, too. So, welcome. This is great. Yeah. Please clap. You ever seen that with the Ted Bush where he just asks the audience to clap? Please clap. Yeah. That's what, please.
Sweet, man.
So, let's just keep going. That's it. I really don't have much to say other than we're just still going. I'm really proud to be joined by everyone in the room and everybody who's watching online. We're not done. If you thought we were done, we're not. Took a while to kind of get into that, but we're here and we're still going. So I don't really have much in terms of a briefing. I kind of just want to get right into the class, and so I'm just going to pass it off to Dennis Speed. So go ahead.
Okay. Well, of course, everybody understands that there was an election in the United States, very large vote. An outcome that was, on the one hand, expected, but not in the character of what has occurred. However, what has occurred is, in one sense, what we're going to talk about tonight, because perhaps something has occurred which is completely different than what all of the characters involved in what occurred think. Now, that's not said to be a wise guy. That's said to ask a question. And it's an important question because these classes, the last few that we've been doing, we've been discussing the writer, the poet, Edgar Poe. We've also been discussing Edgar Poe as a member of an American intelligence agency referred to as the Society of the Cincinnati. There is a sort of a premise in what we are talking about that the American Revolution was based upon and then became, had an institution which was an intellectual conspiracy which was headed by Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was the leading scientists of the United States, one of the leading scientists of the world. And from about the 1750s, he was recognized as such all over the world. But he was also the architect of the American Revolution, and as such had been involved in the creation of a semi-secret society from the age of 16, so from about 1722. That society always had the intention of making a second American Revolution. The first was that which was associated with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, in that the colony of Commonwealth of Massachusetts, unlike any place except for Pennsylvania, had its own charter from 1630. And in 1690, that charter was taken away. Franklin was born in 1706. Actually, he was born in Massachusetts, although he was conceived in Nantucket. He used to say he was, launched in Massachusetts, but he came from Nantucket. From the age of approximately 13, was a conscious agent of a process in which a revolution was going to be relaunched. He was sent to Philadelphia at the age of 16. As part of that mission, he formed an organization in Philadelphia approximately in 1724 called the Junto, or Junta. You look that up, that word essentially means coup. And that organization was had a certain number of members. These things were related to what people refer to as Freemasonry. And in his teen years, Franklin was also infiltrated an organization, British organization called the Hellfire Club. Now, we're not going to go through and discuss all of that, though I thought I should say that, because the American Revolution at the time that it began to occur in 1775, was not necessarily intended to break with England, not initially. What Franklin was trying to do was to create a basis for a more equitable and just association of the colonies, and that the country of England would acknowledge that. But during the period of the 1760s, particularly 1763, the year of the end of what's sometimes called in America the French and Indian War, but was also called the 7 Years' War, fought against the French. Basically, at that point, moves to begin to create what became later, 13 years later, the American Revolution were begun. Even up to 1775, 1774, 75, that was not the final destination, but it became the final destination. And at the point that Franklin and his associates launched that revolution out of Philadelphia, though Massachusetts was a large part of it, the first battles happened in Massachusetts, and they happened in 250 years ago. Starting in 1775, some people say 1770 because of the confrontation that happened that involved the Boston Massacre, as it was called, in which the African slave who had been a runaway, Crispus Attucks, and 4 other individuals were killed. And some people talk about that as the beginning, but the formal beginning was the 18th, 19th of April of 1775. So when we get now 5 months from now, 6 months from now, we will begin the celebration of the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Franklin, who was trying to, as best he could, prepare for that, in contacts that he had in England, in Ireland, in Scotland, and in France, on his return from France in the period of June of 76, had prepared the way by having Tom Paine, who had been was an immigrant from England and Scotland and so on, who had a lot of problems being employed in England, had come to the attention of Franklin because when Paine came to Philadelphia, and Paine witnessed out of his window a slave auction, and he wrote a diatribe against it. He came to Franklin's attention and became a pamphleteer for the American Revolution. He wrote the pamphlet Common Sense. Some people dispute precisely how many copies of this were circulated, but something approximate to between 300 and 500,000 copies were circulated among 3.5 million people. And that would be roughly like about 60 million copies being circulated in the United States of today. Now, Franklin, of course, was a printer as well, and the colonists valued the idea of learning, printing, education, and organizing by that means. Some might argue that that is out of fashion now, but the reason this was so important was because they created an association. It was called by many names in the 1760s and 70s. The Sons of Liberty, the Committees of Correspondence was another form of it, which is the way that the colonies were put together. And then at the point that the revolution was ultimately won, it was called the Society of the Cincinnati. British intelligence was officially created, though of course there were intelligence agents, there were spies, and there were other kinds of ways in which the British were. It was officially created in 1782 to try to counter the successful American Revolution. So although today people talk about British intelligence as being sort of the ancestor of American intelligence, precisely the opposite is the case. It was the case that, in fact, British intelligence was created formally at Chatham House, or the Chatham House Group, in May of 1782. And its intent was to stop the process of the American Revolution from spreading into Europe. The popular narrative that the revolutions, such as the French Revolution, were the serious revolutionary actions of the 18th and late 19th century, whereas the American Revolution was essentially a bourgeois revolution, is exactly the opposite. In fact, several of the people who were like Danton, Robespierre also, Saint-Just, these people were agents of British intelligence. And so the famous or infamous way in which people like Karl Marx and others talked about French Revolution as being the precursor to what they saw as being the more advanced socialist forms of revolution is actually completely backwards. So the revolutionary tradition is not with socialism and not with communism. Revolutionary tradition, the successful one, is with the Americans and with the revolution in Haiti. We're not going to talk about the revolution in Haiti right now, but those were the two successful revolutions. The French Revolution was a failure, and resulted, of course, in the guillotining primarily, but the execution of about 17,000 people, the decapitation of France, the destruction of France, largely as the intellectual center and scientific center, actually, of the world at that time. Although the Americans were very important, they were still colonized. And France was extremely important. Portions of French science did survive, but they were generally transferred to Germany from the École Polytechnique of France to Göttingen and other areas of Germany. And much of the great tradition of German science comes from that time and was created as a result of that. Now, Edgar Poe was a grandson of this intelligence process and semi-secret society called the Society of Cincinnati. The Marquis de Lafayette, who fought in the American Revolution, was the foreign intelligence head of that association. And when he came to America for a return trip, at the end of his life, he was about 67 years old. He came over when he was about 17. Went to Virginia, where he met Edgar Poe. Poe was part of the honor guard for Lafayette because Poe's grandfather had been the quartermaster, kind of a logistics officer for Lafayette. Poe was also at West Point, and without going through a lot of details here, Poe was deployed on various missions, the most controversial or most contested of which was a deployment to France and perhaps to Poland at the age of about 23. And the story of this is told by Alexandre Dumas. Alexandre Dumas, the author of The Three Musketeers, The Count of Monte Cristo, and several other books. Dumas, whose father Alexander Dumas also, was a African who was nearly was the head of the French forces that were intended to put down the problem of the revolts of the revolution, but he was imprisoned before he took that position. Napoleon took it instead. And he is the protagonist of the Count of Monte Cristo. Now, some of this is just said, just first of all, to set the stage for what we hope will be an eventful intellectual experience of the next 18 months or so all over the world. Because one of the things that's going to have to happen is for the change that people actually want, which I will argue, if we have time, has nothing to do alone with Donald Trump or with any other thing. The actual change is very different. And to get at how one could even think about what's needed, what we're going to do is I'm going to have Jose read the beginning of a document that was written by Lyndon LaRouche. At the time he wrote this document, which was 1981, there was something being discussed among members of his association, which is, how could you reform American intelligence? Some of you know, and this will happen, that Donald Trump and others are talking about the need to sort of dismantle various parts of the deep state. This isn't a new concern. This is something that a lot of people have been talking about for a long time. So at the time that this document was written, there was a discussion about creating an academy which would replace the Central Intelligence Agency and various of the other American intelligence agencies. And so this refers to a class series that LaRouche was proposing as a sort of a way of initiating a discussion about that. So you can take it from there.
The classroom education of a good cloak and dagger patriot might or might not, but should include a basic introductory course named Cloak and Dagger 101A. The instructor for this course is named Phil King. The following are a few remarks included in the first class session of that course. The difference between a top-rate spy and the bungler is that the good agent act on the basis of knowing that the most important things happening around them are the things that appear to never have happened at all. It is the things that aren't there that can really do you in, as the fellow said as he was falling down the empty elevator shaft. If you ever catch yourself drawing a conclusion from merely the list of facts you believe you have in your possession, stop yourself right there and think again. As the accountant told the judge, it was the cash that wasn't there that led to uncovering the embezzlement. Always be aware that you may have missed something of critical importance to making a decision. Make a list of the things which you didn't notice, things which might have happened or which may not have happened, which you didn't notice. The most important events among those you have overlooked will usually be the non-events, events which never happened. The most important fact about a wedding is not the guest list or the bride's costume, but the fact that the groom is missing.
Now, so people are all sort of thinking about, and I think we gave everybody copies of the Masque of the Red Death. Everybody have that? Okay, good. There we go, right to it. But I just want to start, have a conversation about, as we get them, or others get them. There are one or two other copies if people need them.
Anybody need it?
In looking at the people that are constantly, the names that you're hearing, you're still hearing, whether those names be Donald Trump, or that it be Biden, the various people in Europe you hear about. Really, all of this is part of a culture that needs to be identified because it's a tragic culture. And all of the policies and all of the initiatives, even of the good ones, are a product of something bigger that it's useful to know about, just to think about it. And I want you to consider this, that if Donald Trump is 78 years old, then that means 50 years ago, he was 28 years old. And if Biden is 82, 50 years ago, he was 32. It's important because the question is, in this case, what was happening 50 years ago? Because if you look at the result of the election, there are several things about that should be said. First of all, not the last time in American history that someone was re-elected after having lost an election was 130 years ago. Okay, and that was Grover Cleveland. It was a completely different era, completely different time. Never has there been a situation where a president has been impeached twice and then re-elected. Never an attempted assassination against the president twice and elected. So one can attribute all of these things to Donald Trump. There's also the fact, not unimportant, if you take the Bronx, about 27% of the Black and Hispanic vote went to Trump. And in general, in the United States, Trump got more votes as a Republican candidate than from African Americans, Hispanic voters, and so on, than anyone. Then you have to go back to Richard Nixon, 1972. That's 50 years ago, 52 years ago. And even with the Nixon case, doesn't really jive. It's a little bit closer to, let's say, the Dwight Eisenhower in 1952. Well, but if you don't know what those, maybe you don't even know what those would reference, and how would the average person, as they say, how would anybody be able to approach what any of that means? There's something I want to pull to your attention because, again, referring to Lyndon LaRouche, he posed something about that generation of which Trump and Biden are part, and people like I am at the last part of that. And he said this. He was talking about the organization of which I am a member, the International Caucus of Labor Committees, he created. But he said the generation from which the organization was recruited had been raised to maturity during the 1940 to 1965 period. So in my case, I'm born in 1952. Okay. So the 1960s, 1968, when King is killed, I'm 15 years old. Now here's what he says about this group of people. The cultural norms which they carried into young adulthood were predominantly the norms of technological and cultural optimism of the 1940 to 1965 period. Okay, so up through when I would have been 13 years old. Beginning 1969 to 1972, a change occurred in the average composition of the politically active generation of young adults. The politically active young adults of the 68 to 72 period included increasingly people whose adolescence and young adulthood had occurred during the 63 to 72 period. There is a marked difference in the cumulative cultural experience of persons born between 1940 and 48 and those born in the age of Dr. Spock after 1952. So I'm born in 52. You're saying at the point I'm born, there's a change that happens. The moral standards of households during the 1950s were already an order of magnitude below the standards of the 1940s. McCarthyism and its chain reaction impact had much to do with this. Now, McCarthyism, you've just experienced in the United States. It was called Russiagate. That whole thing that you went through for the last 8 years around Trump was what was the same as McCarthyism. That was the period when everybody was talking about Reds under the bed, communists everywhere. And to just kind of illustrate that in a way that would be difficult for you to imagine, but the first book, there are two books I got out of the library when I was 8 years old, when I got my library card. Those two books were the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin and Masters of Deceit by J. Edgar Hoover. Because everybody who thought of themselves as being a good patriotic American had to fight the communists. So I got J. Edgar Hoover's book because that's what the world is. It. So now ask yourself, see, because that wasn't because I was precocious. That's because that was the culture of the time. That would have been 1960. Okay, so he's saying the moral standards of households during the 50s were already order of magnitude below the standards, but McCarthyism and its chain reaction impact had much to do with this. So although there was only as little as 5 years difference in age between the freshman university populations of the first half of the 1960s and those of the second half, the cultural differences were sufficiently pronounced to be discernible among siblings. Now, why this is important is things have been good and bad for a long time. That's basically why I read this. Okay, yeah, it's not like what you see as that's like the worst. No, it's hard. And so, last thing we want to quote before we go to Masque of the Red Death. LaRouche said the following: most of the persons entrapped within this new dark age have not been aware that it is a dark age. In those persons, ignorance of the essential features of preceding periods of history, the ignorant ones believe that their poorly educated judgment of the lessons of their own immediate experience is adequate knowledge of the way in which the world works. They look at the world from the inside of the culture characteristic of the new dark age and cannot imagine that the world were ever better or different. So, okay, so that's the setting. Now, this is a story. We are going to refer to some of the stuff we did earlier, but I want to just set the stage and what's going to happen. We're going to read the story. Story done by Poe called The Masque of the Red Death. It's a well-known story in some respects, but it's really self-explanatory. What we're going to do is we're going to read it. And I will get started. And let's line up a few readers. I'll go first. You're going second. Okay. And who else will go? Yeah, right. And who will follow? Okay. Who's number 3? Okay, fine. So we got 3. So I'll start. Okay. Taking my little copy here.
You gonna read off that?
I like that coffee.
Can you read that?
Yeah, Beth can read.
Yes,
He's just saying that. He like to say people that bothered me the time I got on the roller coaster down in Coney Island.
Can you write that?
Yeah, that was I went down, right? The Thunderbolt. This is my 64th birthday, right? So this is new, right? So I get in the line, and so there's 2 guys there. They're looking at me, they're smiling, right? There's a woman there. She says, "Sir." I said, "Yeah." Said, "A serious ride."
The Thunderbolt is fun though.
and then what happened is, right? She says, you're going to need to leave your wallet. And you're going to you have to leave your glasses. Oh, you can't see without your glasses.
Oh,
So it's like that, right? So I get on. I do the ride. I get off and I say, "What? Nothing." She said, "You were scared, weren't you?" So, yes, but I can read this. Okay. The Masque of the Red Death. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal, the redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores with dissolution. The scarlet stains upon the body and especially upon the face of the victim were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men. And the whole seizure, progress, and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour. But the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair from without or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned. With such precautions, the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there were cards, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. Gotta come up.
It was towards the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first, let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suites. In many places, however, which such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here, the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bazaar. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the left and to the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor, which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass, whose color varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. At the eastern extremity was found, for example, in blue. In vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple, and its ornaments and tapestries, and there were and here the paints were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and litten with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestry that hung all over the ceiling and down the wall, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the color of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes were scarlet, a deep blood color. Now, no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum. Amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro, or deep from the room, there was no light of any kind emanated from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite, there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod, bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illuminated the room. And thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all.
Adrian?
It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang. And when the minute hand made the circuit of the face, and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep, and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour, the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance, to hearken to the sound. And thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company. And while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and then were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colors and effects. He disregarded the decora of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric luster. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not.
Just ask Andy, if we have another reader. Anybody?
All right.
Okay.
He had directed in great part the movable embellishment of the 7 chambers on occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders. Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm, much of what has been since seen in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. And then for a moment all is still, and all is silent save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows, through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away, and there flows a ruddier light through the blood-colored panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears, who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly the heart of life, and the revel went whirlingly on, until at length there commenced the sound of midnight upon the clock.
And then the music ceased as I had told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who reveled. And thus, too, it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before. And the rumor of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation and surprise, and finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust.
Anyone else? Okay.
In an assembly
A
of
little bit back. Yes, great, thanks.
in an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade rances of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out heard and gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion, even with the utterly lost to whom life and death are equally just. They are matters of which no jest and can be properly made. The whole company indeed seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor properly existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shredded from head to foot, and the habiliments of the grave, the mask which concealed the visage, was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse, which that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting its sheets, and yet all these might have been endured, if not approved, by the maid revelers around. But the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. His vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with the scarlet hue. When the eyes of the prince hospital upon this spectral image, which with a slow and solemn movements, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moments, with a strong shudder either of terror, of distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage.
Hold for a minute. And then can you pick up from here?
Yeah. Who dares, he demanded hoarsely of the group that stood around him, who dares thus to make mockery of our woes? Uncase the varlet, that we may know whom we have to hang. Tomorrow at sunrise from the battlements, will no one stir at my bidding? Stop him and strip him, I say of those reddened vestures of sacrilege. It was in the eastern or blue room in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand. But now, with deliberate and stately step, made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the murmur had inspired the whole party, there were none found who put forth a hand to seize him, so that unimpeded he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centers of the room to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly round and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of revelers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and seizing the murmur, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had come like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revelers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died, each in a despairing posture of his fall. And the life of the ebony clock went out with the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all.
Jose, you still have that paper, right?
Yes.
And I want you to read again. Actually, this section.
If you ever catch yourself drawing a conclusion from merely the list of facts you believe you have in your possession, stop yourself right there and think again. As the accountant told the judge, it was the cash that wasn't there that led to uncovering the embezzlement. Always be aware that you may have missed something of critical importance to making a decision. Make a list of the things which you didn't notice, things which might have happened, or which may not have happened, which you didn't notice. The most important events among those you have overlooked will usually be the non-events, events which never happened. The most important fact about a wedding is not the guest list or the bride's costume, but the fact that the groom is missing.
Stay right there. Okay. Yes, to the next paragraph.
There are very few real-life situations in the work of a spook in which you will have the luxury of time available to spend hours rethinking the situation in this way. You must learn the mental habits to perform these exercises quickly and automatically on your feet. You must tune these kinds of mental reflexes to the point that you think like this almost instantaneously. Most important of all, you must think like this whenever you're under the greatest immediate stress. At times, the right or wrong decision made at that instance may decide whether you or your nation lives.
All right, so what do people think? What do you think of what Poe's doing? Whether it doesn't work? What does it mean? I mean, apparently when these people assaulted this figure, there was nothing there. He says what the story says.
Could it be like something of their own creation, like their imagination?
Because they
Well, they died.
right.
Right, but they're still
You know,
trapped in the castle.
Because they
Right.
built it with no ingress or egress, no way in or out. Oh, so I guess they couldn't even escape at the end if they wanted to. Because
No.
they're stuck in there with the Masque of the Red Dead.
You have the copy, so if there's anything in the story, right, that you want to refer to, that might, because we should solve the mystery.
Well, the thing I don't get. Oh, go ahead, Carl.
I noticed the dreams part.
Mm.
Like, I thought it was kind of weird where, like, they mentioned that, like, where it says here, the dreams, it didn't start with that. It's like at the bottom of the second page, where to and fro in the seven chambers there stalked in fact a multitude of dreams, and these the dreams writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. So it feels like out of all the rooms that were created, you know, for pleasure, for fun, of all the beautiful colors and all of the different things that, you know, that the pleasure, the wine, the fun, those that the masquerade, the things that were, you know, they created the life of their own. But then that would also mean that their fear of the one velvet room created the death that they were avoiding in and of itself. It is of their own creation, but literally in the sense that they hold themselves up in this castle that they built around themselves to avoid facing the reality that there was a terrible, terrible disease, sickness that was just clawing through the world, killing everything. And to avoid it, they hold themselves up, but then create the same fear, create the same a similar version of the fear that they were trying to escape in their own castle of pleasures. They couldn't escape it because it was more pervasive than their own, you know, pursuit of pleasure. I feel like there's more to it, but
No, that's what, anybody else got,
I think it's important just to,
that's all being picked up, right? People can be heard. Okay.
to look at the beginning. I mean, what's actually happening?
Well,
Because,
before you do that, let me just
Okay.
reread what was just referred to, because she
Okay.
says here, there were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies, such as the madman fashions. There was much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust.
Mhm.
To and fro in the seven chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms. The color comes from the room they're in, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps. And then it makes it clear, and anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet. So that clock is down at the end. Go ahead. Just wanted to-
no, I was just saying, if you look back at the beginning, because the prince is like the head of the government. I mean, he's the government there. It says, you know, so there's this horror going on, and he's happy, dauntless, sagacious, even though his dominions are being depopulated. So it's very much obviously an oligarchical personality, and probably symbolic of the kind of oligarchical mindset. And the idea is just so, yeah, we can just ignore the population. They're not trying to solve it. I mean, in that sense, if we think about what we're dealing with today and people's like complete disregard for,
Well,
yeah,
I hear you, but let's ask other people.
okay, yeah,
I'd like to just hear what people think about it, period. Just
Yeah.
the story itself, what's in it. So,
his name is literally Prince Prospero, and he's the first to die. Like that in and of itself, I feel it's wrong. Like the fact that he can there's the fact that he creates this bubble of he bubbles himself and thousands of other people, and clearly within his standing, other nobles, other dukes, other people who share the same fortune as him. And because they don't have to do the real, because they have the luxury of not having to work or interact with the reality that is around everyone, they feel in a sense invincible. They have found themselves a way to at least momentarily ignore the Red Death, but they still live in a world just like anyone else. They are still human just like everyone else, and they can still get sick.
So then I realized that this, towards the close of the 5th or 6th months of his seclusion, so they've been doing this for 5 months, 6 months. Do they not get bored?
Well, that's why I have to be so grotesque.
Unlimited wine.
Yeah,
they got, they're set.
I was actually thinking, I was asking myself that, like, why is everything that they're doing grotesque if they're trying to block themselves off from the horror?
Well, it's a particular party. We don't really know everything that was going on. We have
Right, but the part you just read, it's like, I think
Like
the impression is that there's a kind of, it's horrifying, but they're all kind of entranced in it. At least that's the
That makes sense, because they keep describing as a lot of his he's very interested in the bizarre. He liked that he was able to make the entire castle like unable to like be seen or walk through all the way through without some type of strange architectural like magic to it. And then there were madmen with different like fashions and then there was just like different things that made it in some ways bizarre and in other ways definitely really grotesque. Because I wouldn't think that the incredible gluttony of this would not be seen as grotesque. It would be like I would think it's after seeing the state of people after the night of one party, it's like okay, maybe you did it a little too hard. Imagine seeing the state of people who have been partying on days
5 months.
on end
Well,
for 6 months.
he Prince Prospero says, "Who dares?" He demanded hoarsely of the group that stood around him. "Who dares thus to make mockery of our woes?"
Our whoa.
What? Yeah, right. Our woes. What? He's saying that the Red Death figure is mocking their woes,
Instead of like their
revelry, instead of their fun. What is?
Kind of like first world problems.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Is Prince Prospero saying like, "Come on, man, we're in the middle of a pandemic. You know, this isn't funny."
It is what he said.
That's what he's saying. Like, there's a Red Death going on. This isn't funny.
Remember Boris Johnson during the pandemic? He was having a party.
You're stopping the party because of a little sneeze? Come on, get out of here.
Anybody else? Yeah.
Interesting. It kind of connects to like people getting bored or like their denial.
Oh yeah, this isn't being picked up. Though.
What's that?
You have to come up. You're too.
We gotta move up a little bit just so we can people hear you. Sorry.
Battery?
If you want to just come on up. Sure. It's fine.
The part that I found like noteworthy was when they're talking about people noticing the sound of the clock and how they get like nervous and uncomfortable and kind of like, all right, it's not going to be the same the next time that the bell rings. But then of course it is because nobody's changed anything or reoriented their attitude. There's like this kind of quiet awareness of the fact that they are rebels. And so I think that they are bored, like you said, but yeah, I found that interesting. But aside from that, I was very curious about, I think it's very much about like when you deny the other, you deny yourself. And then aside from that, I was questioning like why 7 rooms and just like the color, like the specific structure.
Like a rainbow.
Yeah, I didn't really get it. It made me think like maybe like, you know, layers of hell or I don't know. Kind of thinking of Pinocchio too, when like, you know, the kids go to the
Well, he also takes time to describe the fact that every step that Red Death takes, he takes one in every room. As he says, first in the violet, then the orange, and then finally the white.
Yeah.
As if like Red Death is in every room.
Even though they avoided the black velvet room, it was always there in every room. Like with the echoes of the ebony clock in the hall. Like the you explained that, like you pointed out that it was at the end of all of the different rooms. It was like if you took a giant hallway and put the clock down at the bottom, so you could hear it all the way back.
Oh, yeah,
Every time, every hour that the clock stopped, that fear rang through each and every room. That like it was that it was inescapable, regardless of where you stood, even if you didn't go into the velvet room, because in the velvet room emanated that disquietness, that dissatisfaction, even maybe just
The music always stopped.
the music always stops.
The orchestra doesn't have to stop playing. It could have been playing.
You gotta
but
play
it
it over
stopped.
it.
And the dancing stops, doesn't it?
But it's like it's actually kind of funny. they all stop and they look at each other like, oh, okay, well,
Oh, they'll have that.
dying, and yeah, we're just playing it, and then they just they laugh and then just keep playing.
Well, because they keep doing it forever. I mean, that's what the clock is a reminder of.
Well, then it strikes midnight, and then that's when the death comes up.
Yeah, right.
The music dies.
Well, I think it's like anybody.
Yeah, right. But that is what, I don't want to overdo this, but that's the thing. In other words, you have cultures that end. So to be specific, the one that got created in the 1960s and 70s is over. You know, there was a thing that, I mean, there was a set of assassinations and everything was arrested from the time of the assassinations. Matter of fact, people even became arrested as adults. So you have a lot of people who are 70 and 80 years old who dress, talk, and think as they did when they were 15 and 16. They are older. It's like if you see Paul McCartney or somebody, or Keith Richards. There's a good example. Right? Look at that. What's really going on? He's 82, 83 years old. These people are arrested. And the political culture that came about, not because they necessarily created it, by the way, they simply expressed a certain kind of attitude. Notice the thing is that it was folly to grieve or to think. That's what a lot of people thought with the multiple assassinations. The first time, Kennedy, right? People went, no, right? It was a real energy. Malcolm, people just ignored. That was just, whoa, what is that? Right? King gets killed, there's a great amount of sorrow. But when Robert Kennedy gets killed 2 months later, whoa, that's it. At that point, it's just like, go for yourself. We can't do anything about this. Obviously, there's a force out here, and if you touch it, and in the case of the students, this became especially palpable, especially tangible in 1970 when they killed the kids in Kent State, because they killed two groups of kids. They killed some kids in Mississippi, Jackson State, 2 black kids they killed, Black Student Union, like a week before. And then they killed the people at Kent State. 4 got killed, 11 got shot. When I entered college in September, everybody was going the other way. That is, get back in the classroom, put your head in the books, get the law degree or whatever other degree, get out of politics. Because the point was, now they were killing everybody. That was the idea. So it was folly to grieve or to think. And all sorts of peculiar things started to emerge in the society. All sorts of things. And you can name them faster than I can. All kinds of peculiar behaviors. As opposed to a society that holds together in some way. I think the only other thing, I don't want to get off the story because there's probably other things to say, but I do want to bring people's attention to a set of remarks that were made yesterday by Vladimir Putin. They were kind of surprising. He had talked about Trump earlier, but he had a very particular thing that he had to say about society. And I just wanted to reference this. Okay, here it is. He said, the rise of nations and cultures that have previously remained on the periphery of global politics for one reason or another. He's talking about the states of Africa, various of the states of Asia, and so on. The rise of nations and cultures that have previously remained on the periphery of global politics for one reason or another means that their own distinct ideas of law and justice are playing an increasingly important role. They are diverse. This may give the impression of discord and perhaps cacophony, but that is only the initial phase. It is my deep conviction that the only new international system possible is one embracing polyphony, where many tones and many musical themes are sounded together to form harmony. If you like, we are moving toward a world system that is going to be polyphonic rather than polycentric. Hold on, my phone moved on me, but the idea is there. And I actually want to bring up, Jose, that polyphonic rather than polycentric. Sorry, just going back. Yes, one in which all voices are heard, and most importantly, absolutely must be heard. Those who are used to soloing and want to keep it that way will have to get used to the new score now. Okay, so that's what he.
That's pretty funny.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
super.
Yeah. So I think if we think about, that's a different music than the orchestra was playing inside of his castle. Okay? That's a music of discord. There's a term that I know some other people use it, the golden billion, that like there's 1 billion people on the planet and that's who's being taken care of and everybody else can kind of like, make it if you can. And I think the Gaza or some of the other situations have brought out and stopped the stark contrast. So, for example, you can credibly ask the question, if you're a young doctor or a young medical student in New York, well, what right do people have here in getting medical care when these kids in Gaza can't get it? And they're 3 years old and they're 4 years old, so they can't possibly be responsible for a crime. Why should somebody hear it? So that the issue is not that somebody here shouldn't be getting it, but why is it that it happens that these people who have clearly done nothing can't get it? That's not illegal. That's not a political question. That's something completely different. I think I'd just say in conclusion on this, because I think there's many things that can be drawn out about the idea, but in terms of Poe, what he's doing and why he did it. One other thing to say here is that American literature, the building of an American literature, was a big issue of the time. Poe was born in 1809. He dies in 1849. And there's a big sort of battle about this, which I'll only refer to quickly. I don't want to take a lot of time on this because it's another topic. And maybe it's best to just quickly indicate it. As Poe observed on several occasions, American writers, if they wanted to exploit the American book market, had to establish an English reputation first. If Americans were induced to read at all the publications of our native writers, and this is Poe now talking, it was only after repeated assurances from England that such productions were not altogether contemptible. Okay, so he was dealing with a situation of that type. There is James Fenimore Cooper, another writer people know from the last of the Mohicans and so on. He described it this way in 1828. He said, "A capital American publisher has assured me that there are not a dozen writers in this country whose works he should feel confidence in publishing at all, while he reprints hundreds of English books without the least hesitation. The preference is by no means so much owing to any difference in merit as to the fact that when the price of an original author is to be added to the uniform hazard which accompanies all literary speculations, the risk becomes too great. The publisher on this side of the Atlantic has the advantage of seeing the reviews of every book he wishes to print, and what is of far more importance, he knows, with the exception of books that he is sure of selling by means of a name, the decision of the English critics before he makes his choice. 9 times in 10, popularity, which is all he looks for, is a sufficient test of general merit." So in other words, what the British critic says, and the fact that you already know that they sold the book over there, so that the American writers were not being supported. That's why Poe often didn't have money. and they were fighting that battle. And these stories were part of the fight of that battle. But of course, also the topics of the stories were directed against an oligarchy or aristocracy or, landed classes. Not because they were propagandistic in that way, but they were trying to show the morality. And so I think that the fact that this Prince Prospero, the name, is critical and important to think about here. So I think I'll leave it there. But if there are other questions, discussion, let's do that. Sure.
I feel like to tie it back into recent events, when I saw the I forget what it's called, like the Democratic rally for
Maybe you should stand up so people can see you on the camera. I think probably we should do that.
Oh, okay. I think it was called not the DNCC or where Kamala Harris.
The convention?
Yeah, convention, the Democratic convention. Even when I saw this, I saw something similar with the Clinton campaign, where they celebrated a win that never came. They celebrated way too early, right? And I feel like even I now got comfortable in the idea that Kamala was going to win. It just felt certain. I can't really say why. Maybe it was just kind of maybe just the hope. Maybe it's just the way that they portrayed themselves. And maybe just the fact that when it comes to being in that kind of bubble, being in the Prince Prospero bubble, you think that everything is going to end up the way that it would. You would think, that you forget that there's something missing. And for the most part, I the days after the election, after talking to many people, after talking to even people in my family, and I think it's funny because there have been so many years where I've watched videos of people who go to Trump rallies and watch videos to understand the perspective of people who voted for Trump just so I could understand why. And I'm realizing now that in the same way that many Democrats who went out and voted for Kamala and made the calculation that there was how's it said? That there was a calculable
Lesser of two evils.
There was a lesser of two evils, but there was an acceptable casualty to their vote. That there was an acceptable casualty, and that would be the Palestinians. The Harris campaign completely we saw it. We saw it at the Democratic convention. They wouldn't even let a Palestinian speak, even if it was vetted, even if it was edited, even in any case. Just the Palestinian voice was not something that had space within the Democratic Party. Just the Muslim voice didn't have space in the Democratic Party. And just this calculable casualty that they were able to make is the same one that Republicans can make for many others. If they can calculate that, if Democrats can say, hey, if we can make sure that everyone has healthcare and stuff like that, but we shy away from really giving certain people the rights that they deserve, then it's not uncommon to think that the Republicans and people who vote Republican and people who end up in those spaces made the calculated decision that if it's good for the economy, then we can make the decision that, I know that he's a bad guy. I know that he's not the greatest person in the world, but if it is enough for me, then it should be fine. And when you have these lesser of two evils, it's always going to become which evil hurts you the less, which evil hurts you the least. And when it comes to stories like this with Edgar Allan Poe, it hurt them the least in the moment. It hurt them the least in the moment to hide themselves behind a wall of not caring about the populace. It hurt the Harris campaign the least in the moment, not to think about, siding with some of the further left voices of the Democratic Party, like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, or even for the Hillary campaign, and the fact that a lot of the people who I remember watching videos of a lot of the people who decided to vote for Trump originally wanted to vote for Bernie Sanders more than they wanted to vote for Trump. A lot of people, and a lot of working class people specifically, would have rather had policy that was progressive for their own sake in a way that didn't feel like it harmed their morals, but the Democratic Party decided that it was too far left. And when you make those kinds of decisions, where maybe in 2016 it was easier to put someone like Bernie Sanders and people who were further to the left on the chopping block, now we've come to this point where we've ran farther and farther to the right. And I'm hoping that we don't live more stories like these, where we put ourselves in bubbles, where we hide behind who gets and who doesn't. I don't want to live in a place where, well, after the Democratic convention, a bunch of people got COVID, because none of them wore masks. And they all thought, again, along with not having the Palestinian voice, they wouldn't care about any people who were disabled either. Any people who would inevitably fall sick from the fact that they started a super spreader event when they never really fought COVID. They never really did anything to make sure that everyone was safe, and it's just one of those things where it's like the Democratic Party got comfortable in their bubble.
Can I interject? At the night of the election, we were going to celebrate the work that we had done with Jose's campaign and Diane's campaign, and we walked by a table of people that were campaigning, selling buttons for Harris Walt, and they had a watch party inside, and we went up to them. It was Hassan, Ashley, and I, and Hassan immediately struck up a conversation. Within like 15 seconds, the whole absurdity of the situation was there, because they said, well, buy a button. Hassan said, well, I don't want to give them money. And they said, well, why not? I said, well, because they support genocide. I don't want to support genocide. I don't want to give them any money. And they said, well, and then it's, oh, well, there's all these equivocations, all these attempts and we argued for 15 or 20 minutes. And through the course of the argument, this guy reveals that he's a pro-Palestinian protester, activist, who has been, according to his own account, working for the Palestinian cause for 30 years. And he was arrested in Israel doing activism for the Palestinians, et cetera, et cetera. But at a certain point, but he of course he was saying, well, you have to vote for Harris, because otherwise Trump's going to get in the office and he's a fascist and he's going to destroy the country. But I was just thinking about what you said, because I think there's a kind of a bizarre kind of ironic hope in the contradiction that I saw in this guy's mind, because he was looking at us like he was pleading with us. He was pleading for us to tell him that he was making the right decision, and we were just telling him,
no.
Why do you think, like, what do you make of the fact that Dick Cheney endorsed Kamala Harris? And he's like more and more like writhing in his feet, and then finally they asked, oh, well, what organization are you with? Who are you with? And Ashley said, well, we're with LaRouche. And they said, oh, you're in a cult. Oh, okay, you're in a cult. It was like, oh, wait, let's go back like 10 seconds when we were trying to help you figure out the fact that you're supporting a genocide and you don't know why you can't get out of your own skin. Mm-hmm. And so I saw in that he was one embarrassing admission away from sanity.
But wasn't that, again, you said it looked bizarre. Isn't that also just grotesque? the way that they are able to make this kind of like hypocrisy for themselves to live in.
Yeah.
I'm just like taking the word from the page. Like it's not just bizarre, but it's just awful. It's abhorrent.
And
Yes.
and I noticed that same pattern everywhere at work, where I'm going to exercise. People do this mental gymnastics to justify this nonsense.
Yeah.
And they always bring the word fascist to the conversation, and I'm like, should I? At work is really hard, kind of like address it. I mean, the guy who is behind me, and and then what you were reading, Jose, about, I'm gonna paraphrase, but it's kind of like when to say something, and I actually wanted to read it again because it's kind of like the dilemma I am right now. Like I know I had to say something because we need to change that mentality, and it's our duty as to change people's mind. That's you're totally wrong. So I don't. I want to find like the patient, find the moment, find the words to address those situations, but it's really hard. It really sucks. Like,
Well, I think we are getting at something, though, in the discussion, which is partially what the story allows. Because one of the things about the stories, and art in general, is it's a way for you to be able to distance yourself, but at the same time see the tragedy, right? And you know that the tragedy relates to what you're going through. But
I clearly see it.
It's like I feel like since 2016 we've had that clock at the end of the hall. There was some like one of my
But-
friends.
But isn't it kind of since like 1963?
Right. That would be what I would say. That's the way you would see it, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually something that happened a long, long time ago. And it's not merely that it happened at my time, but it was a very, I'll try to describe to you what it was like being 11 years old when that news came in about the Kennedy assassination. You're sitting in school, it's lunchtime or nearly lunchtime, and teacher comes in and says, we're going to dismiss the class because the president has been shot. And she's afraid to even say that, right? She doesn't quite know how to tell you that. The experience you have when you hear that is, at that era, you didn't really experience death very much by that time, even if, let's say, a relative had died. It was sort of a mysterious thing. My grandmother had died when I was 8 years old, but it was a mysterious thing. They have you go in and say goodbye, but it's just like you visited and you're saying goodbye. It wasn't real. This, Kennedy, meant something to many of us. I was reared Catholic, so he's the first Catholic president. He's also younger than everybody else. And the day of inauguration was really cold. There was a lot of snow around at that time. And he is there in just a suit coat. He probably had long underwear on or something, I don't know. But he looked like he was just out there. He has no coat, no hat. And as I've explained it, I was watching it on my best friend's television. He lived across the street. And none of us had color televisions. This is 61. And it was like the TV suddenly went into color. Just because he's saying these things about let the world go forth from this time and place, that the torch has been passed to a new generation. And the effect was that you knew that was you. I mean, he wasn't really, he meant a generation born in this century, because he was the first president born in the 20th century. He was born in 1917. Okay? So, like everybody else, had been born earlier than that. And so he's there, and the whole thing was this forward moving, and that's the idea you had. Right? So, and then his wife And we didn't realize because, of course, 8 years old, but she's like 29, 30 years old. And they would do these things. Like they had all these kids and they would play football on the White House lawn. And then they would do these tours. The television is new at this time, to the White House. So there's this tour, and Jackie Kennedy's doing a tour of the White House, and she's talking about the furniture and all. And you're there, it's boring, right? And then you're waiting to see, is the president going to come on? And then, of course, he comes walking through like it's an accident. And you think it's that. And he starts talking, and he says, I really want to welcome everybody. I want to say to everybody, this is not our house. We're just here for a while. Everybody is welcome here. And someday you who are watching this may be president. And that means the girls too. And like, so it was this kind of, so when he's killed, what happens is in the mind of a child, there's just like shock that goes on all day. And then sometime like late that night, even the next day, then the tears come. Because now you've understood that he's actually dead. Like it's not, this means something else. So what you're talking about that you saw, and the delusion that was offered, which is out there, not merely on any Democratic side, it's there, it's in everything. It's what you said. It's at work. It's at the job. Yeah, it may seem to be around politics, but it isn't. People have the sense that we're all living in something which is all wrong. We want this changed. And whoever purports to say they will change that has to be held accountable. But then there's another problem. Because if the flaws in you, no matter where you run to, there you are, so to speak. And that's what happens in the story. The flaw is not merely a disease that maybe somebody had who was in the group or something. No, point is, the flaw that got them there is there with them because they've never addressed it. The death is that. So when they go to attack the phenomenon, there's nothing there. Because it's everywhere.
Because they never
Right.
fixed the root.
In
They
the
never
first place.
addressed it.
They always brought it.
And the clock is like a metaphor, it's a reminder.
Well, the whole thing is a
moment.
metaphor.
Yeah.
That's the point, right?
But each hour for a moment, it's like their conscience is pricked, and then they try to immediately go back.
Because as a group, they can't do that, right? They can individually feel it as conscience. And it's so strong that no one can, it's the truth defies silence idea. The clock is the truth.
Yeah.
We're in that situation now. That's why the independent candidacies, right, were themselves a metaphor. Diane's candidacy and Jose's candidacies were themselves metaphors. Not that we didn't want to win, not that there's not ways for us to win, but we can't really win until we can awaken the minds of the people to the situation that they're in. We are not allowed to win until we can awaken the people. We are required to do that because that's the requirement we've made. I mean, yeah, it's an objective requirement, but obviously people can win elections without that. We're saying something different. We're trying to do something different. Yes.
What do you say that Bernie awakened a lot of people that he wasn't allowed to win?
I think something different about the Bernie thing. I think that Bernie copped out. I think that he knew perfectly well that he got frauded, particularly down in Brooklyn in 2016. He knew they took the election from. I mean, that's what Assange was doing. And was it Mark Rich? Was that the guy's name?
Seth Rich.
Seth Rich, right? That's what he did, probably. That's probably exactly what happened. There wasn't any Russian anything in any of this.
And a week before the election, Bernie said, there's other things going on besides children being killed in Gaza. And the day after, he said, oh, well, the Democratic Party abandoned the people.
So I think that's, and people like, all these characters like Brianna Joy Gray, Katie Halper, Matt Taibbi, Max Blumenthal, almost all the Jimmy Dore, all these people were Bernie supporters. And actually, to some degree, that's what we've been interacting with since that time. But he didn't, that's my view of what happened there. I also think what's important about this moment, just to say, and maybe others have observations on this, this is a truly auspicious moment. I don't think, and this sort of addresses some of what you said, I don't think that anyone should feel pessimism about this present moment. I don't think that, and I think that what Putin is saying gives you an idea about this. We did need, I think, just to do, we should show just a little bit of that, of the Bach, of the Brandenburg, because I want to have people have a sense of what polyphony means, what he is talking about. There are other forms of this, but I just grabbed this because it was just to show, just to come up a minute of it is fine.
Okay.
Bach. Okay, we're good. Yeah. So now I'll say something about this. Bach, who born in 1685, died in 1750. Is not the person that invented polyphony, but what he did in his lifetime was to create a way of composing in which the idea is that you have horizontal voices moving. They're completely distinct, but somehow they harmonize, and they do it by counterposition. In other words, one speaks, another speaks. But they can speak at the same time. They can move at the same time, but they can move in contrary motion, completely distinctively. But it's all harmonic. And what I'm going to play you now, if Jose has that, you have that? Okay. This is something by a guy, some of you know who he is, some of you won't know. His name is Rick Beato. And what happened was he did a little thing about Bach, which I think will be clear if it comes up.
Put the full volume on that.
I'm Rick Beato. We're about to embark on a journey through time, a journey that uncovers the hidden threads connecting the fabric of modern music. Imagine a world where the echoes of a single unparalleled genius resonate through the ages, influencing not just genres, but the very heart and soul of the greatest musicians we've come to adore. I'm talking, of course, about Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach's compositions are not just masterpieces of the Baroque era, they are the very foundation on which much of modern music is built. We've combined exclusive insights from some of the greatest musicians of our era. Icons like Sting, Bela Fleck, Keith Jarrett, and Pat Metheny, just to name a few. These legends, each a master in their own respective genre, will share their reflections on how Bach's groundbreaking work has shaped their musical journeys. Take a look at how many times Bach has been brought up throughout my interviews.
Dominic and I both have a teacher called J.S. Bach, and he play eight measures of Bach, and you're surprised every time, and then the next 8 bars and the next 8 bars. So composition is really about surprise.
When I interviewed Pat, he made a funny statement.
I've never looked at the guy next to me like maybe I'm doing a little better than that guy. And compared to Bach, man, we all suck.
Tell me about your relationship with Bach's music.
Oh man, I don't want to sound stupid, because as soon as you start talking about Bach, even like what Pat said, it's like you don't want to sound like an idiot.
We're still within the context of Western choral system.
Mm-hmm.
We're not into moving polyphony like Bach, where he's moving.
Yeah, has counterpoint and
yeah. I mean, you listen to some of the Bach harpsichord stuff, and it's like,
yeah.
Compare that to a really good Beatles song. I mean, Bach's winning. Sorry, it's just the way it goes.
I mean, other than Coltrane, as a pianist, I was more interested in. I guess I was Bachian.
Yeah. A lot of counterpoint. Yeah. The movements of the inner lines that you're playing.
Yeah, that was what I did the most of.
Second voice.
I've always been into classical stuff,
Mm-hmm.
like Bach. Actually, I've got a Bach arrangement.
I want to hear it.
For the book.
Yep.
Because I thought everybody should have one Bach piece or classical piece. So you know the song "Whiter Shade of Pale," which everybody loves.
I do. If I were to say to you, Peter, what is your favorite song of all time?
Oh, Whiter Shade of Pale. Just because it's such a perfect song.
It came from Air on a G string,
Right.
which is.
But so I had that.
Okay.
And then I sat down and wrote the Peter Pan verse and I did all, and I had the verse and choruses for a long time, but I was just trying to find some way of lifting it out of that, because I'm a real Bach freak, so very much like that Jesus Man of Desiring kind of thing.
There is that in all of modern music, among all of the people who think of themselves, whatever the genre is, as being either serious or virtuosos, it's clear to all of them that you have to know Bach to know anything at all. The importance of that is not to say, oh, he's the greatest. The point is he's doing something which Putin refers to. He's not the only musician that does it, but that created a system of doing it. He calls it well tempering. We've done, and we will have a chance to talk about this at some other time. But I think what's important is that this idea is you don't want cacophony. You don't also want to have music which is distracting, like the orchestra in the Masque of Red Death. You have to have an idea of distinct, independent, and self-developing vocal interaction among many different people, many different layers at the same time. Nobody's suppressed, but at the same time, it's harmonically resolved. And the thing that you heard Sting say at the beginning about every 8 measures, there's a surprise. There's something different. And that is what music is about. It's not arbitrary surprise. It's the idea that suddenly you have a revelation about your own mind and about something that you didn't see, that you didn't know was there, which you suddenly discover. That's the point of it, because otherwise, if it weren't in your mind, you wouldn't be able to hear it when it's played. So he's uncovering things that are actually already there inside of you. And the notion is to give people their voice. I think that idea, it's also true of a great writer. It's a distinctive voice, but it's sort of all of us seeking to say something on behalf of all of us. And when it's done well, it resonates. You have the idea of a freedom. Like, so this story, for example, frees you to see what wasn't there. Unfortunately, the other people in the story saw it too late. They saw it from the wrong way around. So I think that's all I'd like to present. Any other questions? If not,
8 o'clock.
Okay, good. That's right. I can work.